this talk, and we're really looking forward to what you've got to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giles, and good evening to everybody and welcome. It's lovely to see you all again. You may remember that when I gave the first part of this talk back in March, this slide that I've got up now was the first slide, this idea that the Jesuit schools are a worldwide network. People are always surprised that sometimes they think, well, St. John's is a Jesuit school, well, is it the only one? Well, no, there are a very large number of Jesuit schools around the world. There are around 2.5 million children in our schools worldwide. We teach in 70 different countries, and we teach right from preschool right through to universities, and we have research institutes as well, postgraduate research institutes. So that was the sort of the worldview that I was trying to talk about last time. This time I want to focus in on something now if I can get the slide to work. There we are. I want to focus in on the individual and talk about Jesuit schools being a window on the soul. Now, I wonder what you make of that word soul. So it's a strange word. It's a word we're sometimes not very comfortable using. And yet soul is an incredibly ancient word. It goes right back into Middle English, first of all, the time of Chaucer, but it goes back way beyond that into the 5th and 6th centuries, the Angles and the Saxons. We think that the word soul, it's the same as the German word, probably came across from Frisia, which is where Frisian cows come from. It's what today is the southern part of Denmark, but it's a really, really ancient word in Northern Europe. And what soul means is your being, or the thing that makes you alive compared to things that are dead, like stones. So your soul is your being, the very heart of who and what you are. And in many ways, we've kind of taken it and made it very religious. Your soul is your kind of religious bit. It's the bit you use in church or when you're praying. But that's not the origin. The origin of it encompasses everything about you, about your intellect, your physical nature, your social nature, your emotions, your artistic side, your creative side. Everything is what we mean by soul. And of course, if you travel south in Europe, they don't use that word soul, they use the word anima. And there you get that sense of being animated, of being alive. It's what marks us out as being alive. So I suppose what we're doing is, how do we see into what makes the young people in our schools, in our care, your children, what makes them really alive? What brings them alive in what they do? Well, here's a bunch that some of you may recognize. These are the current Ruds. And they've just finished their exams. So in a slightly choreographed way, they're celebrating. They're definitely a bunch of kids who are very much alive. But they're at the end of their time at St. John's. So we might be saying, well, what have they picked up? What's this window on the soul been like for them? You're all parents, and maybe I can ask you the question, why did you choose St. John's? There are plenty of schools to choose from, but why did you choose St. John's? When I was a head teacher, we would have open nights and open days, just as I'm sure you went to. And I would always ask at the end, I would ask the parents, the prospective parents who had come, can you tell me, what is it that you think you might want from this Jesuit school for your son or daughter? And almost always they would say something like, those children who showed me around, those older boys and girls who showed me around, there's something about them, and that's what I want for my child coming into the school, say at the age of 11. Something like that. They found it really hard to pin it down, but they said there's something about the way you've shaped them, about their character, that I want for my child. It always seemed to me it was a bit of a risk. When I was in a big comprehensive school, we would generally have around 1,500 families come through in one day. And we tried to give them each their own guide among the boys in the school. And you quickly run out of guides. And so from choosing your sort of the ones that you know will do really well and represent you well, you quickly get onto your crooks. And we were slightly nervous about pointing some of our crooks as guides to the school, but they were actually fantastic and had a great great delight in showing people around the school. Although I did come across one boy saying, this is the detention room and I'm in here every single Friday. I'm not sure whether that attracted parents or not. But that window on the soul. So what's that about? What has formed these young men so that we can be proud of them as they go out into the world? This is not a great photograph, not great quality. And if you've got the pictures of everybody on the right, you may just need to move them across the screen because they'll be hiding the key person behind them on the right of this picture. And it's a picture of Pope Benedict. And it's a picture from when he visited the UK in 2010. And one of the things that he did was he had a big assembly with around 8,000 school children in Twickenham in London. And I love this photograph. It's absolutely brilliant because here's the Pope in white coming on, and you've got the girls and the boys here from a primary school, and the girls are looking and smiling directly at the Pope. The boys have no idea where the Pope is. They're just looking off to the side. I think it's a bit of a stereotype, but the boys haven't a clue, but the girls are absolutely focused on what's going on. But when the Pope came, he was talking about what it meant for them to grow up. And he walked into this stadium and this is what he said. My question for you, talking to the kids, my question for you is this. What are the qualities you see in others that you would most like to have for yourselves? What kind of person would you really like to be? And that question, what kind of person would you really like to be? Psychologists will tell you is the most important question that you can ask children and young people. What kind of person would you really like to be? The most important thing that we can do as a school and that you can do as a parent is to begin to shape the kind of person that your son or daughter is. Do you know what kind of person you want them to be? But more importantly, do you have a sense of what kind of person they really want to be? And I'm not talking about, do they want to be a doctor or an engineer or a it's not those things so much, although that's also important. What it is what is your character? What kind of person? What qualities do you admire in others that you really want for yourself? And when the Pope was talking about this, he was talking about it in the context of saints, because he just made a saint, St. John Henry Newman, when he was in this country. And he was saying that the saints, as you can see in this image, they're people that we look on from previous generations and we admire for some reason. They're people who had some extraordinary, outstanding quality to their lives. And we want something of that for ourselves. And so what Pope Benedict was saying to the kids was, well, who do you think the saints in the next 50, 100 years are going to be? And the answer, of course, is some of those saints are going to be you. What are you going to do to make an extraordinary mark on the world, to change the world for the better? Now, what we try and do in Jesuit schools is to have that conversation in a very explicit sort of way. So rather than just leaving it and saying, well, what kind of person do you want to be? We actually begin to drop ideas into their heads. And you as parents, this is what you've signed up for. You've not signed up for a neutral education where we say, well, we don't really care, we don't really mind. We actually begin to say to the children right from the start, well, how about being this kind of person? How would you like to be a grateful person and a generous person? How would you like to be a loving person and a compassionate person? What about being an active and curious person? Once you actually start naming the kind of person that you might want to be, that begins to take on a life of its own. And what we find is that both parents and children say, well, that's not a bad go at it. You might have other words as well. You might have a quibble about some of the words we use, but this is a pretty good profile or description of what we want for good human beings. This is the window on the soul. If you peered into the window on the soul, these are some of the words that you might come up with. So if you take an example, every half term, we pick a pair of these words. And this half term, in all the Jesuit schools, we're looking at the idea of being hopeful and faith-filled So you might say, well, what does that mean? Those are quite tricky ones. They're among the more difficult ones there. What does it mean to be a faith-filled person? Well, it seems to me it's something like saying it's about having confidence in yourself, first of all. Do you have faith in yourself as a human being? And then do you have faith in your family and your parents, your friends, your teachers, your school? Do you have faith in the world, the way the world is going? And ultimately, if you're a believer, do you have faith in God? So there are all kinds of different levels of faith. So do you have faith? Is that something, that trust, that confidence? And then hope is deeply allied to that. You know, there are people who think that the world is going to hell in a handbasket, but kids don't. Kids are hugely optimistic. And so we build that and try and hang on to that as we grow into adults. Do you really have hope for your future, for your family's future, for your country's future, for the future of the world? Or do you think things are a disaster? As we get older, it's very easy to give into the temptation of becoming hopeless. Whereas what we want for our children is for them to be full of hope, hopeful. At the end of the Second World War, when the concentration camps were being liberated, there was one camp in which 3 children had been kept, and they'd been kept confined in a dark room. And as the Allied soldiers advanced, they liberated these children from the room. And as they searched the camp, they found some extraordinary lines scratched onto the wall of this room. Remember, this is 3 small children. And this is what they'd written. I believe in the sun, even when it's not shining. It's extraordinary that children in a concentration camp, locked in a place without windows, brutally treated, could write that extraordinary profession of faith. I believe in the sun, even when I don't see it day after day after day. And then the second line is even more extraordinary. They wrote, I believe in love, even when I feel it not. The sun was extraordinary enough, but the sun is something that's there. You can see it, you can feel it. Whereas love is something very different. These were children who'd been deprived of love year after year after year. They'd not felt it, but they still had that hope, that belief, that faith, that despite everything, the horror around them, that there was still love. And then the final line is quite extraordinary. I believe in God even when he is silent. That to me is an extraordinary step of faith, hugely stronger than any faith I have in God. Even when he seems utterly absent, utterly silent, these children could say, I believe in God. So it's not just us as a school or you as the parents saying, how about these virtues? How about being faith-filled and hopeful? What does that look like? Children have this deeply planted in them. My belief is that God plants these things in us, and our job is to make them grow. Your job and our job in a school and as parents is to water these things so that they grow in your child. How do you nourish that faith? How do you make room for that faith? How do you allow that faith and hope to grow? There's a Norwegian composer called Arneson who has set this to music. And if you want to listen to something quite extraordinary, go onto YouTube and type in Even When He Is Silent and the composer's name, Arneson. It's an extraordinary experience listening to this setting when you consider where these lines have come from. But that's what we're trying to do. We are trying to offer a vision, offer a window on the soul that says, we're not saying to you, just do whatever you like with your education, take your chances. What we're trying to say is, here's a vision. It's a vision that Jesuit schools have had for 500 years across all the continents. How about it? Is this something that you want to be part of? And the kids respond extraordinarily positively. And so as parents, your role is to know this and to encourage this. You recognize this. This is a photograph I took of the front of St. John's in the gorgeous evening sunlight a couple of years ago. And on the very front above the door, there are, just where the headmaster's head is now, in fact, literally just up and to the right of where his head is, there is a roundel on each side of the door. And one of those roundels is St. John Berkman's, the patron of the school. And then the other roundel is St. Aloysius Gonzaga. And then up above the balcony, there's the coat of arms of St. Stanislaus Kostka, to whom the school was originally dedicated. And those three were Jesuits who died very young. They were all in their 20s when they died, their early 20s. And they were all made saints together. And they were made saints in the year that St. John's was opened, which is why they're there on the front of the school. And that one to the left of the door, St. Aloysius Gonzaga, he had this idea. He said, I'm like a piece of hot metal, and that metal needs to be twisted into shape, to be formed into shape. And that's what we do with souls. In our schools, and you as parents, you are soul shaping. It's an awesome responsibility. I'm not a parent, but when I watch my sisters and the way they bring up their children, it's an awesome responsibility to be given this child in whom God has planted these virtues, and to begin to allow them to grow, and taking that care that we don't get in the way or stunt them in any way. And it's the same for a school. A school has got that great responsibility of cooperating with you on that. So I want now to look a little bit about how we do this maybe in practice, and just come up with a few practical suggestions, because I think people found these quite useful last time. Of course, when you're talking about all of this, this is part of all of the busyness of life. And one of the things that staggers people who go to work at St. John's is just how busy St. John's is. St. John's is full on, non-stop. And that has some brilliant sides, but also it can have some damaging sides if we're not careful. So we have to build in times just to stop and to reflect. So there's a question that arises about, well, can we somehow build in resilience into children so that they can grow, so that their souls can be shaped well, but they're not overwhelmed by that experience, a little bit like this picture indicates? And the answer is yes. It's not easy, but the answer is yes. And some of the best work on this has been done by an anthropologist called Emmy Werner. There she is. And she did some groundbreaking work in the 1950s, where she started watching children growing up from a very early age, and she's followed them through until they're adults in their 50s. And what she was trying to notice was which of these people had made a success of their lives, were in stable relationships, had got on well, they weren't on drugs, they weren't alcohol dependent, they didn't end up in jail, they didn't end up with socially difficult relations. Which were the ones that had succeeded as human beings? Who were the ones who hadn't? And were there things, were there what she called traits in their childhood that correlated with their adult experience? And what she found was that there were 5 really strong traits, that if children had these 5 things in their lives, there was a much, much better chance that they were going to be well-adjusted adults. They were going to grow up to live those well-adjusted lives, that their souls, in other words, would be shaped in a way that really sustained them. And she was the first one to use the word resilience in this sense. What is it? There's lots and lots of stuff on resilience these days, but she was the first one to really talk about resilience and self-writing traits. By self-writing, she simply made, you know, if you have one of those yellow plastic ducks and you put it in your bath and you kind of push it underwater, it will bob up and put itself the right way up again. So what she was saying is, what are the skills that children need to bob up and put themselves the right way up again when things go against them? And she said, there are 5. Here they are. The first of them was a bond with a non-parent adult, what she called it emotional modeling. In other words, when your children are very small, the bond is with you, the parents, with their siblings. And then that gradually expands maybe to grandparents, to a wider family. But what she was saying is that as children get slightly older, they need to have a really strong bond with somebody who's not in the family. So she found that that was really important. Very often it's a teacher. Teachers are strong non-parental adult bonds for young children. So Think about that. Think about the bonds that your child has and how you encourage that. And as they get older, do you deliberately encourage them to increase that sort of network of adults that aren't the immediate family? So that was the first thing she suggested. The second thing that her research showed was what she called spark. And if you look at the kids at St. John's, they have this in bucket loads. And that's a huge credit to the school. And it's a huge credit to you as parents for paying for it and for sending your children to St. John's. And by spark, she meant having all kinds of hobbies, sports, arts, performance, all kinds of hobbies, having a go at things. And I don't want to embarrass him, but one of the great things about the headmaster of St. John's is he constantly says to the kids, do the stuff that you're not confident doing. Have a go at the things that you don't think that's obvious. If you're a great sportsman, go and act in a play, go and play a musical instrument. Do the stuff that takes you out of your confidence zone. And Emmy Werner said, that's exactly it. It's about having to practice. It's about failing. It's about getting back up. And it's about what she called islands of competence. In other words, there are kids at St. John's that I could name where I'd say, if you want somebody who's brilliant at befriending younger children, go for him. If you want somebody who's brilliant at leading them out and making fires in the woods, go for him. If you want somebody who's brilliant at showing how to do academic work, go and look at him. Islands of competence. And you might want to reflect on what are the islands of competence that your son has. The third trait that she noticed in resilient self-writing children was involvement in that context in a church, this was in the States, or a community. Church might be less so these days. That's not really the point, whether it's religious or not. The idea is that children grow up realizing they belong to a community. And that's why St. John's talks about community all the time, the St. John's community. And you'll find that in any Jesuit school. We talk about this community, this group of humans, real humans who live together. It's not about an institution. It's not about the rules. It's about the way in which we are human beings living and working, sharing, finding out, failing, getting back up again together. That's what it's really about. So involvement. So again, you might reflect on your own experience with your children. What communities do they feel they belong to? Then the fourth one of these was an inner life. And as part of that, an inner dialogue. And this is something we deliberately try and grow in Jesuit schools. It's why we do this thing called the examen. We stop and we review the day, because this is when you have a little time to reflect that you're part of a bigger thing, you're part of a bigger picture. And that when you struggle, when there are challenges that you face, and if you look at the challenges the St. John's boys face as they go up through the school and they have the 11 plus and the 13 plus and getting into their senior schools and all the rest of it, all of this is immensely challenging for them. And so this inner life, this being able to process this in an interior way, I would say in your soul, begins to build meaning. You know, well, why is this important? Why are we doing this? It's about getting it in perspective. Not getting into Eton or not getting into some school is not the end of the world. And gradually we develop a spirituality, a way of dealing with things, which sort of takes you onto a higher plane, onto a spiritual plane. And the way in which you do this is through what Emmy Werner called healthy self-talk. And by that, she meant literally talking to yourself, not in a lunatic type of way, but in a way that you have an inner narration. You can talk through things. And what psychology shows is that if you do that, you begin to develop this sense of being the author of your own fate. You have a say in what's going on to you. Another way of putting it, she talks about developing an internal locus of control. So it's not just that things hit you and buffet you and the school has expectations and the parents have expectations and you just have to respond, because that's being a victim. But that you actually have a say, you have a voice in all of this. So that healthy self-talk is important. And that again is what we do in the examen. We do healthy self-talk. We talk through our experience of the day. I've used this before. I think some of you heard me before, but one of the most striking examples of this was when I was the head teacher of a secondary school, and I was interviewing all the sixth formers about their university applications. And one girl came in and I said, "Oh, lovely to see you, Emma. What are you applying to do?" And she told me the university, and she said, "And I'm applying to do dentistry." And I said, "Oh, that's interesting. Your parents are dentists, aren't they?" And she said, "Yes," in a kind of way that I thought, there's something more to this. And so I just pushed slightly and I said, "So dentistry is what you want to do, is it?" And suddenly she broke into tears. And when you're a head, that's quite terrifying when that happens in front of you with a 17-year-old. She burst into tears. And she said, "I don't want to be a dentist at all," she said, "but it's what's expected of me." And I said, "Well, what do you want to do?" She said, "Well, I want to be a marine biologist." She was absolutely clear. She knew exactly what she wanted to do. It wasn't vague. And I said, "Well, let's have a chat with your parents, shall we?" So we had the parents in and we sat down. And of course, the parents were absolutely mortified. They had no idea that their daughter had sort of felt somehow corralled. They were really horrified that their daughter had felt corralled into being a dentist. They had no idea she wanted to be a marine biologist. She now has a doctorate in marine biology and is a serious research scientist in marine biology. So that's what we mean by healthy self-talk. And we need to start doing that with children very young. So I hope that that's something very practical for you, sort of 5 things that you can do with your children. If you want a window on their soul, if you want to do this soul shaping, then this isn't some vague airy-fairy thing. This is something really quite practical behind which there's a lot of psychology. So this picture you'll recognize is one of the last places that St. John's boys, in non-COVID times anyway, this is one of the very last places they are, the visit to the chapel. And they've sat in these pews, some of them, since they were 3 or 4 years old, when their feet haven't touched the floorboards. And here they are at 13, sitting here for the last time, and they get quite tearful when this happens. It sort of brings it all together for them. But it's right that these seats are empty. We're not doing all this so they can stay in school. We're doing all this so they can leave these seats and go to their next schools and go to university and go on out into the wide world. But we want them to go out into that wide world, to have that window on the wide world with their souls shaped. We want to send them out being the best people they can be. What kind of person do you really want to be? Come back to the Pope's question. And we hope that in everything we do in the school, that shaping gently and encouragingly takes place. And I hope that you as parents can listen to this and say, that's exactly what I want. That's why I sent my son to St. John's, because this is what I want for him. So I hope that's helpful. And I think that's our half hour. So we'll leave it there. Thank you all very much indeed.
Adrian, thank you very much indeed for sharing that with us. I think the idea of being hopeful is something that resonates strongly with all of us at St. John's. I think it is something which, if we can get inside the mind of a boy and get him to look at every single opportunity, not from the sense of what will happen if this goes wrong, or predicting and valuing something simply by whether they'll succeed or not, but rather by the strength of their own self-confidence that even if it goes wrong, there is something within that I can gain, that I can find something that's a little nugget of gold that we can work with and move on for. And I think the boys at St. John's that instinctively have that mindset of, I'm going to try this opportunity. I don't know whether I'm going to enjoy it. I don't know whether I'm going to be successful in it. What I do know is that I've got the character to be able, whatever happens, to move on from it and get something positive in it. And it's something we work really hard with the boys. And there is that sense of confidence in yourself, but also an instinctive sense of hope. And something happened today teaching the boys RE, which really left me at a moment of reflection, because I'd handed their examinations back. And I happened to be delighted with the boys. We'd structured the examination, so there was an element of knowledge, then contextual learning and adaptable learning, and they knew they'd had the feedback on all of that. And as a class, they'd done extraordinarily well, and they were beaming when they got their results back. And then came, just before the end of the lesson, one of the boys said, "Sir, what is the class average?" Now, I wasn't expecting the conversation, and my guard was down. And instinctively, because I had worked it out, I told them. And it was one of those moments that if I could take it back, I would, because I saw 4 of the faces turn from elation and pride in the progress that they had made, and they could distill the progress they'd made, and they were delighted with it. All of a sudden, that achievement now was related to somebody else. It was no longer related to the progress they had made themselves, but all of a sudden it had been stapled onto how had everybody else done. And it was a moment of quite distinct reflection for me, and I felt very sorry for the boys. I did see them afterwards, and we had a conversation about it. But I think as parents, my first reaction when I saw that afterwards was, I wonder how many times my own daughters have had that experience, and it made me rather sad. And the idea again that independence is so important when we're coming to developing hope, and a sense of creating habits for the boys where they instinctively begin to do this. At the age of 7, 8, 9, and 10, they are not going to be instinctively doing this. But if we, as parents and school, emphasize that taking risks and being hopeful and having the confidence that we can take something positive even when something goes wrong will have a life-changing impact on our children. They don't have to get everything right, and indeed the more they go through life getting everything right, the more risk averse they become, and that's the very opposite of being hopeful. So I think if out of this we can really instill a sense in the boys that to take risks and to get things wrong and see it as a really positive learning experience is something that will stand them in hugely good stead. So, Adrian, thank you so much for giving us a more spiritual context for that as well. I'm very grateful. Ladies and gentlemen, are there any questions that people would like to ask? I've got the participants list. If there are, then you're very welcome to raise your hand electronically or simply turn your microphone on. If there isn't, that's absolutely fine too.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes, I wanted to ask a question. You've been talking about what St. John's in particular and all the Jesuit schools teach the boys. And I was wondering if, what is it the boys teach you, if anything?
Adrian, do you want to answer that? I don't want to cut across. It's your talk.
If I can find the unmute button, just struggling with the technology there. What do the boys teach us? I mean, all the time. It's a little bit like the example I used of those lines written there by the children. I mean, I've been teaching for 34 years, and constantly the children come back and they show you, I think, that they're not just sort of blank slates onto which you're writing or empty vessels into which you're pouring things. There's all kinds of stuff that they come back with, and they come back with it in a I don't know, a really direct and straightforward way that sort of takes you aback as an adult. I know I've seen it in my sisters with their children, where suddenly, you know, one of the children will say something or come up with an idea, and you're just thrown back by it, and you say, it's extraordinary. So I think, you know, sometimes we try and oversimplify, or we think, you know, if you look at all those words that you're talking about in terms of that forming of souls, those 8 pairs of virtues, you might need to change the language for younger children, but they get what you're talking about. They understand what being hopeful is about. They understand what having faith in themselves and other people is about, and God is about. So I think that's what they teach you. You know, they show you these things in kind of glorious technicolor almost, something like that.
Okay.
I think I would say
Thank you.
I've learned not to underestimate them and to give them a voice. And I think if I look back to the own lessons I teach, the best moments of learning, genuine learning, tend not to come from something I've said, but something the boys have said.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions?
I have one question. Mr. Porter, one person which is typically incredibly important on all Jesuit education, or at least it was for me, was this concept of your spiritual guide, or someone, particularly in a Jesuit school, a Jesuit person that is someone that you can effectively exchange, your life, and it's kind of a guiding individual that has a huge influence on your development. Is this something that in St. John's would be available for the kids? And in particular, I understand that you are the person closer, being a Jesuit to the school. Is that sort of institution something that is available at St. John's?
I think it depends exactly what you mean by it. In days past, there would have been a lot of Jesuits around in the schools, and children often, as you say, would have had an individual that they would have related to. We're not in that position. We just don't have enough people to do that these days. But what we have done is we've put, in the last 10, 15, 20 years, we've put a tremendous amount of effort into forming all the staff in the Jesuit schools, so that they can all begin to take on something of that. Now, they might not be sort of very high profile spiritual directors in the traditional sense, although those still exist. But what you do have, I think, is probably a much better strike rate. You've got a lot more people across the staff who get what it is to accompany children and young people in a spiritual life, in this, what I'm calling this soul shaping. So I think the answer is yes, but it is done in a rather different way from the way you described, which is exactly my own experience. That's the way I experienced it too.
Thank you very much for that, because I was just relating to your point earlier around the importance of having a sort of non-parental influence, which I completely agree. And as a personal matter, for me, it was incredibly touching that relationship. But thanks a lot. Very clear.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, any other questions? Well, it's a rather appropriate time to finish, Adrian, because it's starting to rain in Windsor. But so I'm going to duck inside. But ladies and gentlemen, thank you ever so much for taking the time and trouble to join us this evening. And Adrian, thank you very much for, as always, a very enlightening talk. And I've just seen an emoji come up with some clapping hands. So congratulations. That'll be for you. So thank you very much. Have a lovely evening. Thank you, Adrian. And thank you, everybody. Enjoy your evening as well. God bless.